Musonda, it's really great to have you here today. You are a partner in our financial regulatory team here at Mayer Brown in London, and we're going to talk about the important topic of ESG. So I'd just like to start by asking you, how have the recent events in Ukraine and actually also the subsequent fallout into Russia, how has that affected ESG regulation?
So in the immediate space, we have seen, as you know, a significant amount of legislation in connection with sanctions, which is the S in ESG. But alongside that, what has been very interesting is that there hasn't been any halt in the momentum of legislation in connection with environmental and climate change risks. There was a concern that the reliance on Russian fossil fuels and the spike in commodities prices would result in a lot of investment funds and other financial institutions pivoting back into commodities that are carbon intensive, but we haven't seen that. I think the final point is that there has been, in addition to the regulatory pressures to exit certain markets in Russia and Ukraine, also societal pressures that have worked alongside the regulation in order to ensure that some of those markets are abandoned by very large corporates and financial institutions.
And is this a global issue, or is it being felt particularly in certain jurisdictions?
So Europe and the UK have always led the charge in connection with ESG legislation and policy making. We have seen far less coming out of the US, Asia and Latin America. Some of that is because of the geographical proximity to the Ukraine, but it's also because the policymakers are under significant pressure from the electorate in our particular jurisdictions. What we have noticed is that some of the conversations in Europe and the UK have focused around the need for energy transition away from fossil fuels into, for example, nuclear. So some of the ESG legislation that we had discussed pre-Ukraine didn't consider some of the energy mix that we will discuss post-Ukraine.
And how are these ESG regulations impacting, for example, banks or asset managers as opposed to corporates?
So if we look at climate disclosures that are now required under a significant amount of regulation in the UK and the EU, for corporates there is a significant amount of disclosure around the extent to which climate change risk impacted, but also climate change opportunities. For asset managers, banks and other financial institutions, there's a significant amount of disclosure around retail and wholesale products that purport to have ESG characteristics to ensure that there isn't that risk of greenwashing where consumers and wholesale clients purchase products that purport to be green but in fact are not.
And what are the consequences of failure to comply with these regulations?
So in addition to the regulatory sanctions and censure that follows, there is also the potential for litigation risk that can arise out of the mis-selling and greenwashing claims that are made. Alongside that, there is also the potential for reputational risk. So what we have seen with the onset of social media is that in addition to the regulatory pressures and the financial outcome of litigation, there is also potential brand and franchise destruction that follows.
And where do we stand, Musonda, on the S in ESG in the UK and Europe post-Ukraine?
So certainly in Europe, we are seeing from a regulatory perspective the development of what is known as the social taxonomy, which is looking at the extent to which regulation can be harnessed to meet social goals in Europe. In practical terms, what that means is that we have, for example, the European Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive that will require corporates and entities in the financial sector to undertake robust due diligence of their supply chains to ensure that there isn't harm to employees and human rights in some of the emerging markets in which they operate.
And do you think the war in Ukraine is going to have investors and regulators reconsidering maybe certain sectors from an ESG perspective?
So there is absolutely a conversation that is taking place right now regarding the energy mix and the way in which ESG legislation needs to recognise that renewable energy is not at the point yet at which there are significant funds to make that the mainstay within Europe. The other sector that has been interesting is the defence sector, where there is a significant amount of conversation regarding the need for government and military spending in that space as to whether ESG funds can invest in that particular sector if it's not ESG compatible.
Okay, Musonda, moving on to the G in the ESG, how might the war in Ukraine affect corporate governance issues?
So I think the fallout of the war in Ukraine has really demonstrated that good governance is the bedrock of the management of environmental and social risks. And so the issue goes right to the top of the C-suite and is starting to trickle down within organizations. Practical examples of what we are seeing in the regulatory space are, in the UK, banks are now required to have a climate change risk officer at a very senior level. In addition, in the EU, there have been regulatory conversations regarding what is known as sustainable corporate governance, which includes issues such as looking at the way in which remuneration at an executive level should potentially be linked to some of the sustainable goals that corporates purport to achieve during a specific period.
And looking forward, what sort of ESG risks will investors be applying more focus to?
So there will be a significant amount of scrutiny around ESG risks in the next economic cycle. The expectation is, with rising inflation and rising commodity prices, that we will see insolvencies and restructurings. And ESG due diligence will be at the heart of that because of the regulatory risks that potentially arise from it, the litigation risks that I discussed earlier, but also the financial risks, particularly in connection with failing energy companies, where there is this risk that they don't transition into renewable technologies and renewable energy, resulting in stranded assets. I think the final point, as I made earlier, is that reputational risk, ensuring that there aren't embedded within the corporate due diligence potential concerns that will arise post-acquisition in connection with greenwashing mistakes that were made during the corporate life cycle.
And what will regulators be looking to mitigate against in the financial sector?
So in the near term, regulators are looking to bring ESG data providers and ESG rating providers into the regulatory perimeter to ensure that there is more scrutiny and harmonization of the way in which they provide those services. There are also initiatives and measures in connection with the labeling of ESG debt so that investors have far more visibility on the products that they are purchasing. And finally, the creation of standards. So for example, in Europe, a voluntary EU green bond standard has been created in order to harmonise the approach to green bond issuance.
And just to close today, Musonda, what would you say the key takeaways are for any clients who are watching?
I think the first issue for clients to consider is the regulatory horizon scanning. The pace of ESG legislation globally is such that they really have to consider a number of different geographies in which ESG regulatory obligations will arise. Brexit has resulted in divergence between the UK and the EU. The second issue is taxonomies. Increasingly, regulators and policymakers are creating dictionaries of what activities can be described as environmentally sustainable. Navigating those and ensuring that there isn't mis-selling and greenwashing will be a key risk. I think finally, it's really important for firms to ensure that they have embedded ESG into their corporate governance frameworks.